Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah, and we have been doing a series called Days of the Bones, and this is the last session of that series. I'm going to go kind of quickly and close this out. Last time we talked about the purpose of the bones being sent out to all of Israel, and the idea tied to Ezekiel 37, with the bones coming together, and the idea of the bones being the building of the house, the building up of the house, the framing of the house. And so why did the dry bones come together and then Israel raised up and restored? And that was so she could be a great army and defeat the enemies of God. So when we're coming to the last part where we've moved out of Judges 19 into Judges 20, out of the actual story of the Levite and the concubine, and now we're going to see how the reproach that had come on the Levite, who called out to all of the tribes to come and battle the Benjamites, who had brought this great reproach upon him. And so the community had assembled at a place called Mitzpah. Eventually the army of Israel went up to Beit El, and it was at that place where the oracle of God was, in which God gave the order to attack. So it didn't go so well. Judah actually led the attack, and it didn't go well at the beginning because Benjamin slaughtered the army of Judah to the tune of 22,000 that fell on the first day. And the Benjamites had managed, even though their tribal area wasn't all that big, managed to put together 400,000 soldiers. And, the Benjamites put together to fight against 400,000 soldiers of Israel. So the whole community of Israel, the army, was 400,000. I just want you to think about that. Now, Judah itself was 22,000 were slaughtered that very first day. Now, on the second day, the tribe of Benjamin slaughtered 18,000 of the tribe of Judah. So it's very interesting because if you add 22,000 and 18,000, you get 40,000. So what happened was a tithe, like what the Levites were to the whole nation, a tithe had been slaughtered out of the 400,000. Now, typically in Scripture, the number 40, 400, 4,000 has to do with a birth in the natural world, as a kingdom coming forth in the natural world, not in the supernatural world, not in the world outside of time. Those numbers are usually associated with 1 to 10, 100, 1,000. But the natural world has to do with 4s, 40s, 400. Like we saw the children of Israel 40 years in the wilderness. Moses, of course, goes up to the mountain 40 days, receives the tablets of stone, the Torah. Yeshua goes out in the wilderness. All these 40s. King Saul was the ruler over Israel for 40 years, and then David and Solomon, both 40-year periods. These are rulerships and kingdoms that have to do with the natural world again. So now the army of Israel goes up to Beit El. Things are not going well. They cry out to the Lord, and they fast until evening. And there they make their burnt offerings and their peace offerings and ask the Lord to intercede for their great loss. So it didn't start off, they were doing the right thing, but it didn't start well at all. So just a reminder that the Ark of the Covenant is there in Beit El at this time, and so now they're seeking counsel from the Ark, from the oracle of God. So on the third day, God promised that he would hand over the Benjamites to the nation, to Israel. And so strategy was set, and they drew Benjamin out, the tribe of Benjamin, from the city. And at that particular time, Israel only loses 30. And then God intervenes, and Benjamin, however they do this, Benjamin thinks that they've actually defeated the army. And so God routs Benjamin, and Israel eventually destroys Benjamin. In fact, 25,000 of Benjamin fell. Now there's some just little discrepancy here with the numbers. It's one place it talks about there being 25,100, and therefore there would be 900 left over. In another place it appears like there are 1,000 left over. That's it from the 25,000. So we basically, from 25,100, we have the 24,000 that are left. And The men of Israel swore that none after this point would ever be able to marry a man from Benjamin. So that's kind of a big deal. And the nation, as it's up at Bethel, is grieving over the loss of this missing tribe. They need the whole tribe to be gathered together. So they built an altar, again at this place, offering up their burnt offerings, and pleading and crying out to the Lord, saying, "Today one of our tribes has been cut off, and the people are repenting, and they want to restore the tribe of Benjamin." Following that, they put to death approximately 12,000 from an area called Yabesh Gilead, and out of that, they found 400, so you got our number 400 again, 400 virgins were brought to the camp at Shiloh, at the tabernacle. And Benjamin returned, and so Israel gave those 400 virgins to the tribe of Benjamin so that they could continue to reproduce. See, this is one of the keys of the whole context of the temple is that, and the house is the place where life comes forth. So cutting off a tribe is, it's like being barren and not producing life. And so this is a big deal. So now they need these wives, these virgin girls to come and so that they can continue on the tribal name. They wanted to, all of Israel actually was instrumental in the fact that Benjamin could preserve their inheritance, their tribal inheritance, and the tribe itself. So they have this imagery of the vineyard. They're to go and the Benjamite men were to go and hide in the vineyard and wait for these 400 daughters of Shiloh to come out so that they could catch a wife. And so they have this kind of celebration here. Interesting too, vineyards in scripture are often associated with the temple as well, where the watchtower in the vineyard is actually a picture of the inner sanctum of the temple. And again, that's another whole story, but we have this festival is to honor the Lord at Shiloh and probably connected to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And so each year this festival would be celebrated in honor of Adonai at Shiloh. And again, the men of Benjamin hiding in the vineyards, watching for these girls to come out so that they could dance. They would come out of the vineyards and catch a wife for themselves. And so all these girls that were dancing, they would take from those girls and carry them off. And they would take the girls back to their land as part of their inheritance. And so therefore, every man who went up and secured a bride would be instrumental in the inheritance. So this is significant. Again, probably associated with Yom Kippur, the dancing in the vineyard, a picture of the restoration of the entire house of Israel having to do with the vineyards. And we talked in the program way back in one of the first sessions about the vineyards that are in Ephraim today in the Samaria, Judea Samaria region in particular, in Samaria, that they are just producing amazing grapes and these wineries that are there. So all part of the restoration of Israel, and that land belongs to her. Now, if we jump back for a minute to Genesis 49:27, this is where we have a prophecy, if you will, of what would happen to all the tribes. So it's interesting. The tribe of Benjamin was called in this account of the tribes here a ravenous wolf. In the morning devouring prey, in the evening still dividing the spoil. Usually, we think of the wolf as a wild animal, and of course they love sheep. But there's something else being communicated here in terms of the wolf, and I would just suggest that it's. Yes, we know the imagery of the wolf in sheep's clothing, and we think of the wolf on the outside coming in and being in sheep's clothing, but I would maintain the wolf in sheep's clothing has to do with those on the inside, that it's hard to tell those on the inside that are wolves, inside the camp, inside the house. And again, this particular prophecy, Yaakov gave to each of his sons. They were to gather together, and he would tell them what was going to happen in what we call the Acharit Hayamim, or the end of days. And that, to me, is a time going forward. It's a prophecy That is not, in essence, there will be a fulfillment of it, but it's an ongoing prophecy that gets fulfilled over time in various different situations of the. So this is one example of how this prophecy is fulfilled in that Benjamin is this devouring wolf. And I think it's pointing to this particular time in Israel's history. We can read in John chapter 10 and 12, talks about the wolf dragging off the sheep and scattering them. If you go back to that passage and you read it in its context, you'll find that the wolf was actually the leadership of Israel, the leadership in the temple. And we talk about the one who comes to kill, steal, and destroy. It's not talking about some external enemy. It's talking about Israel's rulers, the power elites in Israel. And I think that's essentially what the wolf signifies. It drags off the sheep and scatters them. And again, this is in the context of inside the camp, that the leadership is inside the camp that's taking advantage of the rest of the sheep. In fact, it's interesting that King Saul, Shaul, from Benjamin, is called a wolf that shall tear like one who tears apart the kingdom. So that's, you think of this ravenous wolf, what was his goal? It was to tear apart the kingdom from inside through the leadership. And so that, again, causes the sheep to scatter. And we can read in Ezekiel 34, has lots of prophecies about the shepherds. In ancient Mesopotamia, all shepherds were always referred to as the rulers or the kings. That any king in Mesopotamia was called a shepherd. So that was something, clearly they knew that. And then talking about the sheep scattering without the shepherd, without their king. We see that happening to Israel over and over again. They scatter because they don't have a king. And so this period of the judges is really a time of scattering. Of course, the judges intervene and help deliver them in certain situations. Talks about the sheep becoming food for every wild animal. And just as a shepherd looks after when he finds himself among the scattered sheep, so too I will look after my sheep. So the promise in the midst of, even in the camp, that the Father and ultimately Yeshua will take care of the sheep, that he will rescue the sheep from all the places where they have been scattered and return them to their own land. So that is one of the key messages of the Bible. So by returning to the land, that means that the monarchy, the kingdom can be set up. That's the key. Return to the land, the temple is built, and the kingdom goes forth, and then the king rules and reigns. So coming into their own land was really seen as a picture of entering into that sphere where God was dwelling in the midst of them, and that they were in their temple. So going back for a moment and looking at, this is the way Joshua divided up the land, and hopefully you can see this. Ephraim looks kind of big in comparison to Benjamin, and then Judah down below Benjamin. Benjamin's sandwiched in between these two tribes, and Bethlehem and Judah, Jerusalem kind of on the border between Benjamin and Judah. So all of this is hopefully, then Shiloh is just straight north there. All of this is what it looked like after the conquest of Canaan. So originally they were divided according to the size of the tribe, the word of the Lord, and they cast lots. But we have a description now in Ezekiel of a different tribal structure of how the land is divided. And I think it's kind of interesting that it's divided into these things called 25,000 rods, which is the number that was left there was the number of the Benjamites that were taken out. And so, I don't know, possibly a connection there. So now it appears that the land, instead of sort of these circular things all over the state, all over Israel, now we have it in strips that measure 25,000 rods. And so from north to south, across the whole width of the land are these strips. And these at this time are not political boundaries like they had been. And so we have 12 of these strips, what we call terumah, or like a gift, and an offering in some way, a voluntary offering. So this is the place where finally the Shekinah, or the indwelling presence of God, would come to rest. And Israel was to be, as a holy temple, the bearer of the divine glory. The terumah was the portion that was given to the nasi, or the prince, that we have written about in Ezekiel. And the nasi was the one, he essentially represented all of Israel, the whole house of Israel, when it was united. And Judah, Yehuda, and Benjamin were bordered on this sacred area called the terumah. So in this particular picture, you see the holy portion. And you see everything's divided into strips. Do we know that this is how it looked like? I don't know. This is possibly a new division. But the key is the portion between Judah and Benjamin. Now you see that where Judah and Benjamin are is flipped from what it was originally. So all of this, again, we're looking at building the house. Building the bottom of the tabernacle was stones, and we read in Peter about building a house with living stones, building up the body of Messiah, that this is the same picture of Israel, that a living tabernacle has been raised up. Pictures of resurrection, bones being attached so the house can be built. It speaks of the reality in Israel and our reality today, that there is always an enemy within. Like, we get totally frustrated, and Christians disappoint us, there's no question, and sometimes they betray us. And lots of times, leadership betrays us. This is nothing new. Israel experienced this her entire history. This is a pattern that we all go through. And so lots of times, the enemy, or the wolf within, is actually the ruler, the leader, or the shepherd. And so we have certainly we have those shepherds, those kings outside the camp that would oppress Israel, and but we also have those inside the camp. And this is what happened by the time we got to the Second Temple period. These ones that are operating and ruling the temple, the high priest, for example, they weren't even a legitimate priesthood. And they oppressed the poor. They did everything in opposition to what a king was supposed to do. The king was to bring benefit and prosperity and blessing to the community. The king was to take care of the poor. All of these things, the orphans and the widows and those that were downtrodden, that was the king's responsibility. But these kings, these shepherds that were ruling over the temple, didn't care anything about the poor. They only cared about their fiefdom and about their power, and they were willing to sacrifice anything to do with the people in order to join with Rome, the power of all of that particular period. They cared nothing for the people. And so it's into this environment that Yeshua, the true shepherd, comes and tells us so. They understood when he was talking about a shepherd what he meant, as being a ruler and a king, etc. Of course, he didn't come in the way that they expected, but nonetheless, as he comes and his blood is shed, and he, through that process, brings forgiveness of sins and is raised up to be the king. And, having the enemy working within can be very destructive. But Yeshua, of course, is serving in a way as our high priest, although he didn't serve in that capacity in the physical world. But the idea of him and his body and us is that we are supposed to work together to build up the community. That was the purpose of the bones, was to build up the house, to provide the structure and the framing. And we're supposed to work together in conjunction with one another, so that the kingdom will go forth and spread throughout the world. I think in many cases that we really hamper that growth because there's so much infighting, and one of the biggest pitfalls, I think, and especially with leadership, is the spirit of jealousy and competition. And Sometimes when you start to be, quote, successful in the eyes of the world as a leader, you think it's you. And pride and arrogance step in, and then that is the end of you. I mean, once you're operating under those attributes, you can just kiss your little fiefdom goodbye. So the tale of the concubine is delivering a powerful message to Israel. And I think in particular to like the little people, to the regular folks. And this is really, that was the message of Yeshua, that he came for the we nobodies, and the nobody knows, nobody cares, and there you are, slaving in your life, working hard, trying to build your home and bring life out of that. And you're dealing with all kinds of things, possibly health things, you're dealing with financial things, you're dealing with relationships that are sour or whatever. Well, the rulers of the religious community don't care anything, not all, but you understand what I'm saying. And so Yeshua, our King of Kings, is the one who came who does care about all those things in your life. And he's working in and through you if you will allow him. And again, I think this message of the concubine is speaking of how much he cares for the little guy that doesn't have power and isn't one of the elites, and even though the oppressors come. So the context again for everything has been the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God. And this is where the problems begin, and it's where everything is restored. And so it is supposed to function as the place of the presence of God. We know even in the Second Temple, there was no Ark of the Covenant in the inner sanctum in the Holy of Holies, and God's presence was not there. So it's very interesting in that regard. Now we've only got a few minutes left, so I thought this was pretty interesting, so I'm just going to share with you. Mashiach, that is our Hebrew word for the anointed one, for Messiah, for the King, and in his relationship with the tabernacle, how you can see the connection even in his name. If we take the consonants in Mashiach, so just bear with me for a second in this, in thinking about that. So the very first letter, and if you don't know Hebrew, just again bear with me, but hopefully you can appreciate this. The very first letter of Mashiach, Messiah, anointed king, we call the letter Mem. And Mem stands for special, it can obviously stand for a lot of things, but in particular in this relationship, Menachem, which means comforter. So you might recognize the Holy Spirit as being called the comforter, the Menachem, the one who brings rest. All the enemies have been defeated. The one who brings comfort and consolation. And that is, he will console and soothe the anguish of his people from their exile. Everything is about getting out of exile, returning to the land, and having our King ruling and reigning. But even within exile, he's the one who comes to comfort and bring consolation to those who have no power. The second letter that we have, Mem, and then we have Shin. And in terms of the Mishkan, or Mashiach, and the tabernacle, that represents Shiloh, which is one of his names. And it says he will become the king and reign over the people, restoring law and order and giving gifts. The root of Shiloh is actually shalach, which means to send. You might recognize shliach, which is is a term for the apostles or the sent ones. Moses, for example, was a sent one. Yeshua described himself as a sent one, a shliach, and related to Shiloh, and it also is related to Siloam, pool of Siloam, which is really the pool of Shiloah, where the sent one. And then we have the letter Yod. It's a hand, and it ties here to what we have Yinon. And this is actually referring to fish that multiply rapidly and endure. So that the concept of fish and sea being very prolific. The idea of under Messiah's reign, in context of the Mishkan, in the house, is that the world will be fruitful and multiply. And is that not the very first commandment we have in Scripture? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And that filling of the earth is filling a courtyard So we have heaven and earth and the seas, and at the end of Genesis 1, all of these courtyards, heaven, earth, and sea, were filled with God's possessions. And so the ultimate possession is his body, is his people, and he wants to fill his people with his treasured possession, which is the essence of who he is in the indwelling presence, so that they may be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. This isn't about your little fiefdom. This isn't about you as king over your sphere, or about you being highly successful in the eyes of the world. This is about being fruitful in the kingdom and producing fruit. That is, in essence, all of what the gospel is about. The final letter in Mashiach is the Chet, and it can stand for Chanina or Chen, which is grace, and the idea that the Messiah will bring grace and peace and harmony. Now, those words are kind of abstract. What on earth is grace and peace? But they are, in Hebrew understanding, concrete. When you're talking about peace and harmony and shalom, you're talking about a kingdom established. Those are words that are associated with the king when he takes his seat on the throne and rules and reigns and brings rest and harmony to his kingdom. And he is bringing fruitfulness and blessing. And you can see how different this is from just the whole world of the judges, which was kind of upside down and in chaos. Yes, rulers came to try to defeat the enemies that would come against Israel, but they weren't successful. It was a very trying time. And everything, as I mentioned, was pushing forward to the for the kingdom to be instituted and the king installed, and all of it pushing forward to the time when King David would become king over the whole region, over what we call the dual monarchy period. And so the Judges is that period leading up to the kingdom, and in some ways we can look at our own time in history as a period leading up to that time of that when the King of Kings will rule and reign and restore all things, and the enemies will be defeated. And it's not about us, leaving the planet and going into heaven and everything and floating on a cloud and everything is good. It's about the restoration of heaven and earth when there is no longer a division between the two. That is when our King will rule and reign over the entire cosmos. It is a time in which creation itself will be restored. That is the purpose that Yeshua came, as the king over creation, and he would restore all things. That's what we look forward to. We're not looking forward to getting out of here and leaving everybody else, holding the bill. We're looking forward to the time when heaven and earth are restored, creation has been renewed, and the function of what the Bible is speaking about fruitfulness, that only the king can bring in all those who are considered part of his holy house, his temple. And so the message of the concubine being cut up into those pieces speaks volumes. And I'll close with this from Ephesians 2:15. He has made us one and has broken down the fence which divided us by destroying in his own body the enmity occasioned by the law. He did this in order to create in union with himself from the two groups a single new humanity, and thus made shalom, thus made peace, thus brought a kingdom. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time. Shalom.